this? Later on this week, on Thursday, the big fight between Puerto Rico's own Amanda Serrano, 7-division champion Amanda Serrano, Argentina's own Daniella Bermudez, 3-division champion Daniella Bermudez. It's going to take place on Thursday, and, I like the fight. It is intriguing. I am going to be tuning in. But my heart really is with Daniella Bermudez here because I just don't know how she's going to perform at 126 pounds, featherweight. That really is Amanda Serrano's best weight. She's campaigned in 7 weight classes, won titles in 7 divisions, but featherweight really is her best weight, and that's according to Amanda Serrano herself. That being said, Daniella Bermudez really isn't a natural featherweight. Her best weights are either 118 or 122. So at 126, what's going to happen? How will this affect the women's ring IQ pound-for-pound list? In truth, Daniella Bermudez doesn't hold a world title at 126 pounds. Amanda Serrano does. Thus, if Amanda Serrano beats Daniella Bermudez, it's a good name on her resume.
Very good.
Better than most, but it's not going to move her along in the ranks. Reason for that is Daniella Bermudez is the smaller fighter moving up in weight. Daniella Bermudez is the smaller fighter who, if she wins this thing, will advance because she's the fighter taking on a naturally bigger fighter, not Amanda. Daniella Bermudez, by some chance, wins this fight, were to win this fight, that would make her a 3 or 4 division champion. Currently, Chicagoan Jessica McCaskill is ranked ahead of Amanda Serrano for having beaten more active world champions than Amanda, in spite of not having been a champion in as many divisions as Amanda. Amanda is a 7-division champion, whereas Jessica is a 2-division champion. But unlike Amanda, Jessica's an undisputed champion. She was unified at 140 pounds, beat 2 world champions there, and she's the undisputed champion at 147 pounds, welterweight. That brings the head count to 3 active reigning world champions that Jessica McCaskill has unseated to Amanda Serrano's 2. Amanda unseated the then reigning WBO lightweight champion, Maria Maderna, back in 2014. More recently, she unseated Heather Hardy for the WBO title at 126 pounds, featherweight. Comparatively, Jessica McCaskill has taken on a better quality of competition in a shorter amount of time and far less fights, far less divisions. Erika Farias wasn't just any world champion at 140 pounds. She was the consensus #1 champion at 140 pounds. She then took on the very tough and durable Anaí Esther Sanchez for the WBA title. Anaí Esther Sanchez, who gave Chantel Cameron and Jessica fits. Very durable fighter. She moved on from that and took on the consensus #1 Cecilia Brækhus in the welterweight division. These are higher-ranking champions than the champions that Amanda Serrano took on, comparatively, in spite of having been a world champion in 7 weight classes. And beating a smaller fighter, moving up in weight, should she beat Daniella Bermudez, even in spectacular fashion, she still is a naturally smaller fighter that doesn't hold a world title in the featherweight division. That doesn't compare to beating Cecilia Brækhus 2 times. Jessica was the smaller fighter in both of those fights. She was the smaller fighter moving up in weight. Thus, if Amanda beats Daniella, it's a good name and it'd be a solid win, but nowhere near as solid as moving up in weight and beating Cecilia Brækhus. Thus,
she won't move past her.
It is either going to take unification matches in the featherweight division or campaigns at other weights against world champions, active world champions who are in possession of world titles. That's what it's going to take. Now, if Amanda by some chance were to unify the entire featherweight division, then she would move past Jessica.
She could.
That's what it would take. It's not Amanda Serrano's fault, by the way. I mean, I don't want to convey that message. Jelena Marjanovic is the one that chose to forego the unification match between herself and Amanda. So it's not Amanda's fault. It's just that's the way the cookie crumbles. That's the way it is. You're going to try to move past Jessica McCaskill. It's going to take more than beating a naturally smaller fighter moving up in weight to do it.
It's not supposed to be easy.
This is a very exclusive list that excludes a lot of other fighters, a lot of other world champions. Thus, just being ranked on the list is an honor in and of itself. But in order for Amanda to move past Jessica, it's going to take more than beating a naturally smaller fighter on the come-up to do it. And maybe she will. I'm not putting it past her. Maybe she gets Sarah Mahfoud in the ring in her very next fight, assuming she beats Daniella. Amanda Serrano's the apex predator at 126 pounds at featherweight.
She is.
Nobody punches like Amanda at 126, and I mean nobody.
And that's why I feel for Daniella Bermudez.
Because she's leaving her comfort zone for this fight. Yet again, she's fighting a dominant champion in their backyard, not hers. Daniella Bermudez is from Argentina. This fight's taking place in Puerto Rico. You think the judges are going to do Daniella Bermudez any favors in Puerto Rico? And that's assuming she can even take Amanda Serrano's power, which I don't know if she can.
It takes a lot of courage to do this.
To take on an apex predator at their best weight, in their prime, in their backyard, when you really don't even have to. Daniella could have sought to unify with one of the other champions at either 118 or 122 pounds, where she holds two separate world titles with two separate sanctioning bodies. She chose to forego that and instead chose to go after a big fish, one of the biggest fish out there.
It takes a lot of courage to do that.
The odds really are stacked against Daniella Bermudez in more ways than one, even if she can take Amanda Serrano's punch, even if she can make this fight close and competitive.
Even if.
If it's close. Do you think the judges would do Daniella any favors in Amanda's backyard, in Amanda's neck of the woods?
Let me tell you something, sweetheart.
This is boxing, not badminton. This is the sport of boxing, sweetheart.
All right.
If the fight's close, if the fight's competitive, it's no secret that 9 times out of 10, sometimes 10 times out of 10, the hometown fighter, house fighter, gets the nod. Now, I'm not saying that Amanda Serrano's going to rob her. I don't know. The fight hasn't taken place yet. I literally don't know what's going to happen. I don't know that any of Daniella Bermudez's power will carry into the featherweight division. I don't know that she can take Amanda Serrano's power. Maybe Amanda sparks her out of there early.
She might.
I'm just telling you that Daniella Bermudez deserves a lot of credit for taking on this challenge when she really doesn't have to.
Because she's the naturally smaller fighter, whether you want to accept it or not.
In welterweight news, a recent interview on the go, if you will, conducted by Fight Hub TV with the reigning unified welterweight champion, Errol Spence Jr., who, if you ask me, appeared to be quite inebriated. It seems that Errol is back on the wagon.
It was off the wagon.
No, it's on the wagon.
Back on the wagon.
He's drunk, okay? He's fucking drunk.
All right.
It's crystal clear, seen in the images here, that Errol Spence Jr. is quite inebriated. And if these images are not enough, I'll post the link to this interview in the description box, and you can make what assertions you will. It seems that flipping that Ferrari and having that near-death experience for Errol Spence Jr. was not reason enough for him to put the bottle down.
I'm not the least bit surprised.
And that's because since the car accident that almost ended Errol Spence Jr.'s life and his career, since that accident, this isn't the first we've seen of Errol potentially picking the bottle back up, going from boogeyman to booze hound yet again. I've talked about it here on the channel. I'll leave the link to that video in the description box. I'm not the least bit surprised. I chalk it up to the environment that many of these PBC fighters are in. You know, the bad habits they pick up. You know, Keith Thurman ballooning in weight, Adrian Broner ballooning in weight, Gervonta Davis ballooning in weight, David Benavidez losing his world title first time due to a banned substance and the second time due to missing the weight, losing the title on the scales. It comes as no surprise to me that Errol Spence Jr. is back to his old ways, continuing the bad habits that almost ended his career in 2019, late 2019. And I do chalk it up to the environment that many of these fighters are in, because they're fighters. They adhere to instruction. And a lot of the fighters over there on that side of the street are pretty lax.
It's not an excuse.
I am in no way, shape, or form attempting to explain away Errol Spence Jr.'s behaviors, because he's a grown man after all. Fighter or not, he's 31 years old, ain't he? You know, so he's responsible for what he puts into his body. Moreover, because he's an athlete, and that's the rule of thumb for athletes.
It's still on him.
But if you find yourself asking the question, how's it possible that this guy could have a near-death experience, flipping that Ferrari, an experience that could have effectively ended his career while he was still in his prime years as an athlete? How is it possible that he could return to the same bad habits that almost killed him? If you're trying to characterize it, well, I think his environment has a lot to do with that. That doesn't excuse it. That doesn't explain it away. It only characterizes it. Derek James doesn't seem to have a problem with Errol Spence Jr.'s drinking, or maybe he does and he's not saying anything, and he's going to wait until it's too late before he decides to voice any concern. Maybe this is a product of his environment, having too many yes men around him, no one to offer up an opposing view to his actions. I think a very similar theme is running
Wilder.
When it comes to Deontay Wilder. The fighter that he could have been, but ultimately did not become, the fighter that he did become, as a result of having too many yes men around him. That, Deontay Wilder's got a strong punch and not much else. According to Mark Breland, There are a lot of things that Deontay Wilder didn't do in preparation for fights. And given the quality of competition that he faced, he never went on to be anything more than just a one-handed fighter. A limited fighter of limited boxing ability who can punch, yes, but beyond that, just isn't much of a boxer. That's the byproduct of having too many yes men around him. And when I see this, I feel that a very similar theme is in play. Isn't there anyone around Errol Spence Jr., went around him to tell him that, perhaps having flipped a Ferrari, maybe he shouldn't be drinking at all. Maybe he should swear off the alcohol because, he's got his limits and he doesn't seem to know what they are. I hope they at least caught this guy an Uber as somebody drove him home. I hope he's not still getting behind the wheel in this condition. Let me tell you something. You ain't got to be Sherlock Holmes to see that Errol Spence Jr. is hitting the bottle in this video. You really don't. The same way you didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to figure that when he crashed that Ferrari at, 3 or 4 in the morning after leaving a strip club, that he was likely under the influence.
He was.
You didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes or Perry Mason to know that. This is only relevant to this conversation. This is only relevant to the sport of boxing because we, the boxing fans, have a barometer for what to expect moving forward from Errol Spence Jr. If you're not living like a fighter, it's gonna show up sooner or later.
This is a very jealous sport.
I'll tell you what I think. These lapses in judgment we see from several of these PBC fighters are a byproduct of an environment where the fighter, the athlete, doesn't necessarily have to be at their best because they're not going to be competing against the best. They're going to be put in situations, favorable situations for the most part, the way that Errol Spence Jr. has been put in favorable situations. I mean, even after the car accident, he was still favored to beat Danny Garcia.
He was.
Before that, Sean Porter. He himself characterized Sean Porter as easy street. And before that, I mean, who really thought that Mikey fucking Garcia was going to beat this guy?
Not me.
We're seeing here is a byproduct of a fighter who isn't at his best because he's accustomed to not having to be at his best. A byproduct of the PBC island policy to where you're not actually exposed to the world of boxing so much as the PBC world of boxing. And that's why so many of their fighters seem to develop these self-destructive habits that in one way, shape, or form always show up in the ring. So many of these guys want to be the next Floyd Mayweather Jr., but Floyd Mayweather Jr. didn't have these lapses in judgment.
He didn't.
He was never seen in this condition. He was a consummate professional. Say what you want about his personality and what you think about the matchmaking and all those different things, but what he wasn't was a booze hound. What he wasn't was a drunk. These guys, they're focused on the wrong thing. These PBC fighters don't seem like they're readying themselves for a phone call that could arrive at any minute, at any moment. They're not those kinds of consummate professionals. At any moment, these guys will take a year off or even 2 years off away from the ring. What do you think that does to their performance? What do you think that does to their fighting ability? And while they're not fighting, what do you think they're doing?
He's hitting the licks.
Quite common to see a dead drunk Errol Spence Jr. make a public appearance.
Boxing's resident wino.
You might want to fault me for saying so, but one way or another, this really is a sad state of affairs for the American boxing scene, that this is one of our homegrown American boxing stars, quote unquote, and this is the state of him. The silver lining, the saving grace for the American boxing scene, the American boxing fan, is that a few bad apples over there on PBC Island don't necessarily spoil the bunch. There are several homegrown American fighters, up-and-comers, the next cycle, the next crop of fighters here in the United States that exhibit a high ceiling and don't exhibit the bad habits we've been seeing from many of the PBC's fighters. The PBC is sometimes viewed as America's ambassadors to the sport, and that's really not the case. I mean, not when you have fresh faces like Tristan Calcaruth, who was in action this past weekend on the undercard of Ortiz versus Hooker. You have Tristan Calcaruth,
8 wins and no losses with 6 knockouts,
campaigning out of the cruiserweight division. You have Steven Nelson, 17 wins, 14 knockouts, no losses, campaigning out of the super middleweight division. He exhibits the potential to be a somebody in the very near future.
We've talked about Edgar Berlanga.
And the potential he possesses as what could very well be the face of Puerto Rican boxing in this part of the world in the very near future. He is an American-based fighter, after all. Ammo Williams, who was in action on the undercard of Chocolatito versus Estrada 2. He's yet another promising up-and-coming homegrown talent from right here in the U.S. of A. Keyshawn Davis, the amateur standout who left lasting impression on a lot of people in his professional debut, also on a Matchroom card.
Jared Big Baby Anderson.
A top-ranked fighter who's been producing exhilarating knockout after exhilarating knockout as he progresses in his professional career, as he develops as a fighter. Don't let those guys over there on PBC Island sell you the idea that good boxers aren't coming out of the United States anymore. I know for the longest time those guys have seen, like, the United States as ambassadors to the sport, but that's what they ain't. That's what they're not.
A good number of those guys are on their way out.
A good number of those guys just aren't active enough for what they are doing or what they aren't doing to be relevant to anyone, let alone the boxing community at large.
They're not.
The next cycle, the next crop of American fighters have the American boxing scene's future in their hands, and the future looks bright. There are some familiar faces that are set to make waves very soon, in the very near future, like Shakur Stevenson. It's not all doom and gloom in the US of A. It's just that what familiar faces became familiar the last couple of years from the American boxing scene, I think they squandered the opportunity to be as great as they could have been. They found themselves in the limelight and squandered a lot of opportunities. But the next cycle of guys, the next cycle of homegrown talent here in the US of A, well, maybe they'll learn from those fighters' mistakes, because I look at a fighter like Keith Thurman, and I don't see a guy who's going to get into the Hall of Fame.
I don't.
Same applies to Danny Garcia. To some degree, it applies to Errol Spence Jr., who, while still being an unbeaten fighter, an unbeaten world champion, unified in the welterweight division here today, he's got a lot of bad habits that could derail his career yet again, and he doesn't seem to have learned from his mistake.
What's his claim to fame gonna be?
The guy's already in his early 30s, and so far he beat Kell Brook off a loss. Sean Porter, who was previously beaten by Kell Brook. He beat Danny Garcia, who has no solid wins in the welterweight division in spite of having been there for, 5-6 years?
None of these are Leonard versus Duran level fights.
None of these are fights on the scale of Trinidad versus De La Hoya. They're just not.
And if he doesn't fight Crawford, what's his claim to fame going to be?